In 1630, the Dutch conquered Brazil from the Portuguese. This is when they began their interest in slave trading. A while later, the Dutch conquered another stronghold from the Portuguese. In Ghana, they conquered the Fort Elmina, which later becomes the most important Dutch base in Africa. They mainly traded with America because they considered the indigenous inhabitants to be too weak for work on plantations.
In 1667, New Amsterdam was traded for Suriname. Suriname became a flourishing colony when the Dutch were driven out of Brazil. There were many plantations on Suriname, and the main export there was sugar. Different things were also grown in Suriname, such as indigo and cotton.
In 1700, the Dutch were banned from trading with foreign countries. Because of this, the Dutch slave trade declined. However, it increased again after 1730 because the WIC lost its monopoly. Because of this, other smaller companies entered this type of trading.
Trading the slaves became illegal in the Netherlands after 1814. But even though it wasn't legal after that, a lot of companies still continued trading in slaves, which made the Netherlands one of the last European countries to officially stop trading in slaves. The Netherlands then eventually stopped completely in 1863. In 1863, 33,000 slaves in Suriname were freed. So were 11,000 slaves from the Dutch Antilles. The slave trade by the Dutch ended because the demand for slaves decreased. The slaveholders got 300 guilders for every slave they owned in Suriname, and 200 guilders for every slave they owned in Curaçao. Sadly, the slaves themselves didn't get anything and were forced to work on the plantations as employees for a very low payment. Luckily, this ends in 1873 when Asians take over the plantations.
The transatlantic slave trade began during the 15th century when Portugal, and subsequently other European kingdoms, were finally able to expand overseas and reach Africa. The Portuguese first began to kidnap people from the west coast of Africa. Think of countries like Angola, Congo, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ghana. And to take those, they enslaved back to Europe. These slaves were often sold to Europeans by the African slave traders.
The slaves were often kidnapped or captured in battles. The slaves were exchanged for iron, guns, gunpowder, mirrors, knives, and cloth brought by boat from Europe. The slaves were then taken to forts, heavily fortified against attacks from pirates and from any European nation with which they may have been at war. The forts allowed the slave-trading nations to increase their shipments, develop strong commercial networks in Africa, and provide their colonies with a continuous supply of slave labor.
From holding gold, ivory, and other wares, the castles gradually imprisoned slaves, who were reduced to yet another commodity. The majestic fortress along Ghana's breathtaking coast housed dark dungeons, overflowing with misery and despair, until the slaves were abolished by each of the colonial powers in the first half of the 1800s. But by this point, the irreversible and immeasurable damage was done. From West Africa alone, it is estimated that 6 million slaves had been shipped to other countries. About 10 to 15% perished at sea during the so-called Middle Passages, never reaching their final destination. The Americas and the Caribbean called the New World. The strongest ones who were transferred to ships and put into space at the bottom of the ships.
Most times, these spaces were too small for the amount of slaves that needed to be transported. There were no bathrooms, so the slaves were fed. The food was often spoiled. There was no hygiene. There was close to no fresh air. The perfect place for diseases to spread. Slaves suffered from seasickness, diarrhea, and the smallpox. These transfers could last from 2 to 4 months. The average life expectancy of a slave at birth was just 21 to 22 years old.
From 1500 to 1880, somewhere in between 10 and 12 million African slaves were forcibly moved from Africa to the Americas. Those who didn't die on the journey became property, bought and sold like cattle. They chose to trade Africans because if they traded other Americans, they would revolt because they knew the surroundings. Africans didn't know the surroundings and it would be very hard for them to escape. Africans were captured by other Africans and sold to the Europeans for goods, usually metal, tools, fine textures, or guns. For the Europeans and the Africans that sold other Africans, they were seen as property. After the Europeans traded for the Africans, they put them in chains, stuffed them on boats. As proof of purchase, they cut off their ears. The boats could hold, at largest, about 400 people, and then every slave would have about half a square meter of space.
The lack of hygiene, the brutal punishments, and the way slaves viewed white people caused about 1/5 of them to die at the ship. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while some were raped. The men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and prevent them from rebelling. Africans who survived the trip were completely dehumanized and treated as property. They would be branded and sold, like they did with cattle.
The life of the slaves were dominated by work and terror, but mostly work. The slaves did all types of work, from housework to skilled craftswork, and some even worked as sailors, but the majority of them worked as agricultural laborers. Most of them planted, harvested, and processed sugar, working 10 months out of the year, from dusk till dawn. The worst part of the job was fertilizing the sugarcane. This required slaves to carry 80 pounds of baskets from manuring their heads down hilly terrain.
When it came to harvesting and processing the sugarcane, speed was incredibly important. Once cut, sugar sap can go sour within a day. That meant that slaves often worked 48 hours straight during harvest time, working without sleep in the sweltering sugar press houses where the cane would be crushed in hand rollers and then boiled. Slaves often got their hands in the rollers, and their owners kept an axe on hand for amputations. The average life expectancy of a slave on a sugar plantation in the late 18th century was 23 years old.
The slave population began increasing naturally. This meant that more slaves were born than died. This may sound like a good thing, but of course it was its own kind of evil, because it meant that slave owners were calculating that if they kept the slaves healthy enough, they would reproduce, and then their slave owners would be able to steal their children and use them for their plantations or sell them.
A lot of slaves tried to escape, but would often fail. Their owners would place huge, heavy metal rings with bells around their necks, or have dogs chase them. One brave soul did succeed, though, Harriet Tubman. Harriet fled from the Edward Broad's plantation in Maryland to Pennsylvania, a state where slaves were free, in 1849. She then changed her name from Misty Tubman to Harriet Tubman. She later also joined a group that helped other slaves escape.
While her exact route is unknown, Tubman made use of a network known as the Underground Railroad. This informal but well-organized system was composed of free and enslaved blacks, white abolitionists, and other activists. Slavery was abolished in 1865 after the Civil War, which lasted from the 12th of April 1861 to the 9th of April 1865. The American Civil War was fought between the United States of America and the Confederate States of America, a collection of 11 southern states that left the Union in 1860 and 1861.
The conflict began primarily as a result of the long-standing disagreement over the institution of slavery. Some states, the United States of America, believed that slaves should be free, but other states, the Confederate States of America, believed that they shouldn't. Blacks were still treated horribly after slavery was abolished. Black codes and laws were passed in different periods in the southern United States to enforce racial segregation and weaken the power of black voters.
Late in 1865, just after the United States Civil War ended, the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK, was founded. The Klan is a secret organization that used terrorist tactics and to target newly freed African Americans, attracted defeated Confederates who resisted the changes of Reconstruction. Under the cloak of darkness and disguise, the KKK worked and enforced with white supremacy at the political and social order of the South. The Ku Klux Klan is a domestic terrorist organization founded shortly after the United States Civil War ended. It has used intimidation, violence, and even murder to maintain the white supremacy in the Southern governments and in social life. It sadly still exists.
Blacks were given more freedom and rights. However, When they try to exercise their new rights, they encounter intimidation and violence, much of it organized by the Klan. The first black child to ever attend public school was 6-year-old Ruby Bridges. On November 14, 1960, Ruby became the very first African-American child to attend the all-white public William Frantz Elementary School. Ruby and her mother were escorted by federal marshals to the school. Ruby Bridges is only 60 years old right now.